Millions of people read the Passover story and encounter a massive historical blind spot. We are told the ancient Israelites left Egypt in such a hurry that their bread did not have time to rise. But for anyone who bakes modern bread, that timeline makes zero sense. If you mix water, flour, and yeast, the chemical reaction begins instantly. So how did this dough stay flat?
The confusion stems entirely from applying 20th century kitchen science to a Bronze Age reality. When we think of yeast today, we picture those little foil packets of active dry yeast that we buy at the supermarket. That is an industrial product, standardized in the late 19th century. In ancient Egypt, the baking process was completely different, and understanding that difference changes the entire meaning of the Exodus.
The ancient Egyptians were the master brewers and bakers of the ancient world. So what exactly were they using to leaven their bread, if not commercial yeast?
They used what we would now call a sourdough starter. In ancient Hebrew, the specific term is seor. Ancient bakers did not add an external powder to their dough. They took a handful of raw dough from yesterday's batch and let it sit out. The wild yeast and bacteria naturally present in the air and the grain would colonize that dough, fermenting it until it turned sour and bubbly. The next day, they would mix that fermented ball, the seor, into the new batch to make it rise. It was a perpetual, living organism passed from day to day and even generation to generation.
A perpetual culture requires constant feeding and maintenance. You have to keep it alive. So when the biblical text says the Israelites were commanded to rid their homes of leavening, it is not just talking about sweeping up breadcrumbs.
Precisely. The Torah contains two distinct prohibitions for Passover. One is against eating chametz, which is the finished leavened food. But the other is a strict command to remove all seor from your domain. Before the Israelites ever marched out of Egypt, they were commanded to destroy their sourdough starters. This is the crucial detail that resolves the timeline problem. When they mixed their dough on the night of the Exodus to take as provisions, they had no seor to add to it.
That completely reframes the narrative. The bread did not fail to rise simply because they were running for the border. It failed to rise because they had intentionally destroyed the active culture that would have caused it to rise quickly. They were carrying nothing but raw flour and water.
And without that starter, flour and water will still eventually ferment and rise, but it depends entirely on wild yeast floating in the air, slowly colonizing the mixture. According to halakha, or Jewish law, that natural fermentation process begins after 18 minutes. That 18-minute threshold is exactly why modern matzah bakeries operate with such intense urgency.
I want to dig into that 18-minute rule because it seems arbitrary. Why exactly 18 minutes? Does the yeast look at a clock?
The Talmud calculates this based on the time it takes to walk a specific distance called a mil, but practically speaking, 18 minutes is the rabbinic consensus for the window of time where flour and water, constantly being worked, remain unleavened. After 18 minutes of sitting idle, the airborne yeast takes hold and the dough officially becomes chametz. So if you visit a handmade shmura matzah bakery today, the workers are racing against a timer. From the exact second the water touches the flour, they have 18 minutes to knead it, roll it, perforate it, and bake it. Then they have to stop, clean every surface, and start the clock over, just to ensure not a single rogue wild yeast cell has time to activate.
The physical process makes sense now, but in the Jewish tradition, historical events and physical laws always point to a deeper spiritual framework. Chabad and Hasidic philosophy view the Exodus not just as a physical escape from slavery, but as a psychological blueprint. If we apply that lens to the seor, the sourdough starter, what does it represent?
In Hasidic thought, specifically in the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who authored the Tanya, the seor is the ultimate symbol of the ego and the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara. Think about what a sourdough starter does. It takes a humble mixture of flour and water and inflates it with hot air. That is the exact mechanism of pride, or gava. The Alter Rebbe explains that chametz represents self-aggrandizement, the swelling of the ego that leaves no room for anything higher than the self.
There is a profound irony there. Chametz and matzah contain the exact same ingredients, flour and water. The only difference is the hot air. One puffs itself up, and the other remains flat and unpretentious.
That is the core of the metaphor. Matzah is called lechem ani, the bread of affliction, but it is also called lechem emunah, the bread of faith. Faith requires humility. It requires a person to recognize their own smallness in the face of the infinite. When the Israelites were in Egypt, the text says they had descended to the 49th level of spiritual impurity. They were steeped in a culture of ego, dominance, and hierarchy. To be redeemed, they could not just walk out the door. They had to eradicate the spiritual seor. They had to destroy the inherited culture of pride that had been passed from yesterday to today.
I see a tension in that demand. We need a certain amount of ego just to function, to build a life, to protect ourselves. Destroying the starter entirely feels like a dangerous psychological stripping. Why the absolute zero-tolerance policy for chametz on Passover? We do not see this level of extremity with other dietary laws. If a tiny crumb of non-kosher meat falls into a massive pot of kosher stew, Jewish law often says it is nullified. But if a microscopic crumb of chametz falls into a Passover dish, the whole thing is ruined.
You hit on a central theological debate. Why is chametz treated with such absolute severity? The Hasidic masters explain that while certain negative traits can be redirected or moderated, arrogance is uniquely destructive. The Talmud states that God says of the arrogant person, he and I cannot dwell in the same world. Ego is the root of all other spiritual corruption because it places the self at the center of the universe. Therefore, the command is not just to avoid eating chametz, but to search it out with a candle, to sweep it from the corners of your home, and to burn it. You cannot put your ego in a drawer and save it for later. The discipline of the Exodus requires you to burn the mechanism of your own inflation.
This makes the haste of the Exodus look less like panic and more like a deliberate spiritual tactic. If they had waited around, if they had let the dough sit, the natural environment would have leavened it anyway. The wild yeast of Egypt would have infiltrated the bread.
The Alter Rebbe teaches that the redemption had to happen in what he calls matzah mode. The revelation of the divine was so intense and sudden that the dough of our ancestors did not have time to become leavened. The awesomeness of the moment prevented the leavening. In a psychological sense, when a person experiences a true encounter with the transcendent, the ego has no time to reassemble itself. It stays flat. That is the state of bitul, or self-nullification, that the matzah represents.
It forces a complete reevaluation of the Passover Seder. When people eat the matzah, they often focus on the deprivation. It tastes like cardboard, it is difficult to eat, and it reminds us of poverty. But Chabad.org points out that the Haggadah actually makes two distinct statements about the matzah. Early in the evening, it is called the bread of affliction. Later, it is called the bread of redemption. How does the exact same cracker shift from representing slavery to representing freedom?
The shift happens through the process of the Seder itself. At the beginning of the night, we are acknowledging our brokenness. We are eating the bread of the slave, the person who owns nothing and has no control over their time. But as we recount the story and move toward liberation, that exact same flatness becomes the vehicle for freedom. A slave is flat because he has been crushed by his oppressor. A free person is flat because he has consciously chosen to humble himself before God. The physical object does not change. Our consciousness changes. We realize that shedding the ego, shedding the seor, is not a loss of identity. It is the removal of a barrier.
I want to circle back to the person who sparked this topic. Cynthia, our listener who bakes bread and could not understand the physics of the Exodus. When she feeds her sourdough starter and watches the dough rise magnificently in the bowl, she is participating in one of the oldest human traditions. But she is also watching a live demonstration of chametz. The beauty of the rising dough is undeniable.
There is nothing inherently evil about bread. We eat challah every Friday night, and it is a mitzvah to do so. The yeast, the rising, the expansion, these are necessary parts of human existence. We are meant to build, to grow, and to take up space in the world. The lesson of Passover is about origin and foundation. Once a year, we have to return to the baseline. We have to strip away the accumulated pride of the past 12 months, the seor that has been quietly multiplying in the background, and remember that our foundation is just flour, water, and faith.
It is a reset button for the human operating system. You clear the cache, you delete the corrupted files, and you start over with the most basic, unadorned version of yourself.
That is a perfect analogy. The matzah is the uncorrupted code. It is what we carry out of the narrow places. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which translates to straits or narrow boundaries. Leaving Mitzrayim means leaving the narrowness of our own self-interest. You cannot squeeze a swollen, inflated ego through a narrow strait. You have to deflate. You have to leave the starter behind.
This conversation completely dismantles the childhood version of the Passover story. The Israelites were not disorganized refugees who forgot to pack the yeast. They were participants in a highly orchestrated spiritual operation. They proactively destroyed the living culture of their own enslavement, and they marched into the desert with nothing but raw ingredients and trust. The bread did not fail to rise. It was commanded to remain humble. If this breakdown of ancient baking and the architecture of the ego changed the way you view the Exodus, send this episode to a friend who always asks the best questions at the Seder table.